Penguin Random House Audio presents The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance by Dan Egan. Read for you by Jason Culp. In memory of Christopher Marsh. Note to readers. Pure phosphorus, element 15 on the periodic table, does not typically exist on its own in the natural world. Even though phosphorus atoms are required by every living cell on Earth, they are naturally bound up with 4 oxygen atoms to form molecules called phosphates. This isn't a book about oxygen atoms, so in most all cases, I will use the term phosphorus, though there will be cases in which I quote people using the term phosphate. Similarly, I am aware that the preferred scientific term for an explosion of a type of nuisance and sometimes poisonous phytoplankton is an algal bloom, but the general public typically uses the term algae bloom, and the general public is the target audience for this book. Along those lines, this book is not intended to be the last word on phosphorus. Many in the general public might not yet be aware of the phosphorus troubles the world is headed toward because of the element's dual roles as a dangerously potent toxic algae booster and as an essential and increasingly scarce crop nutrient. But there are scientists who have been on these problems for years, and there are a host of emerging technologies and practices to address one or both sides of the overuse scarcity problem tied to phosphorus. This book does not provide a survey of them. I discuss some potential paths forward to put the world back into a better phosphorus balance, but this book isn't intended to provide a prescription for the phosphorus paradox. It is an introduction to it. Introduction. In late summer 2018, Abraham Duarte was roaring down a neighborhood street in Cape Coral, Florida, at highway speed when a constellation of blue and red lights started to twinkle in his rearview mirror. He ditched his black Lexus and tried to escape on foot into a tangle of backyards, but he ran out of lawns sooner than expected. As the hard-breathing cops closed in, body cams rolling, Duarte had 2 choices. He could turn around, face the jangling handcuffs and the consequences of resisting arrest after being pulled over for speeding, or the 22-year-old who sports a tattoo on his left arm that reads "Taking Chances" could swim for it. Duarte plunged into one of the canals that cut through Cape Coral neighborhoods like so many nautical alleyways. It was the wrong choice. The problem wasn't that Duarte didn't know how to swim. It was that he didn't exactly jump into water. The surface of the canal was smothered in a brilliantly green algae goop thick as oatmeal, and poisonous. "Help! I need help! I'm going to die!" Duarte screeched, as toxic fumes overwhelmed him, while officers on the canal bank anxiously radioed for backups to bring a rescue rope. Duarte's face started to bob into the slime. One officer coached him to float on his back, to keep his mouth and nose above the poison. "Fuck, dog! Fuck! Fuck! Damn! Holy shit!" Duarte wailed as he tried to dog paddle to shore. "You need to get out of that stuff. That is going to mess you up," shouted one officer. "Seriously, man, that is going to kill you." Duarte's feet finally hit bottom when he got within several yards of the canal bank. At that point, it was clear he wasn't going to drown, but he wasn't out of trouble. He began to vomit violently. As Duarte neared the canal wall, he reached up and the rubber-gloved cops heaved him ashore. They rolled him onto his stomach, handcuffed him, and gave him a quick shower with a garden hose that was nearly as green as the muck coating his eyes, nostrils, and throat. Muck that Duarte said smelled like human feces. He was taken to the hospital and later charged with resisting arrest without violence and possession of a controlled substance. Days after Duarte's close call in the canal, even as he was recuperating from being treated for gastrointestinal and respiratory distress, television news anchors across the country smirked as they narrated the cops' body camera chase video. The clip might have added to the legend of Florida Man, the Internet's fixation on Sunshine State males who make headlines for committing bafflingly stupid acts. But Duarte's plunge into that toxic quagmire is more than a meme. It is an omen. That same summer, in the little city of Stuart, a beach community on the opposite side of the Florida peninsula from Cape Coral, some 100 panicked homeowners showed up at City Hall in the middle of the business day to demand something be done about the same green goo plaguing their own coastal waters. It was a sweltering July day, the kind towns like Stuart are built for, but signs on the boardwalk outside City Hall warned visitors. Blue-green algae. Avoid contact with the water. As people at the meeting introduced themselves and stated their affiliations, it became clear this was not a typical gathering of environmentalists. They weren't strategizing about how to protect some beleaguered species and the faraway lands or waters upon which it depends. These people, who represented businesses as well as homeowners associations and fishing and yachting clubs, spoke as though they were the threatened species. "I need help," said Will Embray, a scraggly commercial fisherman whose business had collapsed right along with the region's schools of mackerel not long after the green slime arrived. "There are a lot of people like me that need help." The 45-year-old was suffering chronic stomach pain that was initially diagnosed as diverticulitis, and then ulcerative colitis, and then Crohn's disease. Eventually, doctors had given up trying to figure out what made Embray so sick. Embray didn't need to spend tens of thousands more dollars on more specialists, CT scans, and lab tests to figure out the nature of his illness. He knew it was the poisoned water, and he wasn't alone. So many patients had been showing up in local clinics and emergency rooms, reporting mysterious respiratory issues and gastrointestinal illnesses, that in the days before the City Hall meeting, the head of the local health network had declared a public health crisis. To gauge the scope of the algae scourge that had become a summer fixture in Stuart over the previous few years, he instructed clinics to begin asking these patients whether they had been swimming or had other contact with open waters. Not good news for a place billed as one of Florida's top 10 beach towns. "Unbelievable, ladies and gentlemen," said the host of the meeting, a local Republican politician. "For anybody out there listening, this is real. This is happening." A famous ecologist named John Valentine made a dire prediction in the early 1970s. Decades of reckless industrial and municipal polluting threatened to do to North America's rivers and lakes something akin to what reckless farming had done to the Great Plains during the Great Depression, when drought-parched, wind-whipped soils seeded black blizzards fierce enough to blind jackrabbits and turn hundreds of thousands of prairie settlers into environmental refugees. "Sometime before the year 2000, unless something is done to avert the situation," said Valentine, who was the chief scientist for Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, "we shall find ourselves in the middle of an algal bowl, with effects on water comparable to those on land during the Great American Dust Bowl of the 1930s. In some nearshore areas, Lake Erie's famously walleye-rich waters had, by the 1960s, already degraded into a soupy green fishless stew. The type of algae smothering Erie and other water bodies at the time wasn't poisonous, but it was lethal nonetheless. The green mats, which sometimes spanned hundreds of square miles, sucked so much oxygen out of the water when they decomposed that they created vast dead zones in which almost nothing could survive. By the beginning of the 1970s, Lake Erie had become known as America's Dead Sea. Lawmakers spanning the political spectrum responded by enacting the Clean Water Act, which brought sweeping water quality improvements to Lake Erie and waters across the continent by finally prohibiting industries and cities from treating public water bodies as waste lagoons. To speed along the cleansing and prod future generations to do better, Valentine took on a second job and personality. He began appearing as Johnny Biosphere at auditoriums across North America dressed in safari garb and with a beach ball-sized globe strapped to his back.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?